Hello and welcome back to Integral Live. My name is Corey DeVos. I am the editor-in-chief here at integrallife.com. And I tell you, today we are in for a real treat because today I'm sitting down with a really, really dear friend, longtime ally of the Integral movement and the Integral Project as a whole, Beena Sharma. And Beena, how you doing today?
I am doing great. Mostly, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this. We've been talking about doing the show for a couple months now. Really, if you track it back, we've been talking about doing something together for at least a year or so.
Yes,
And
longer.
before we start, I was thinking maybe you could share a little bit more about your background, just sort of, you know, what brought you into the Integral fold in the first place so many years ago, and really what led you to what we're going to be talking about today, which is this Integrating Polarities web course that you and I are going to be exploring and unpacking in a monthly show as we go. So why don't we start off with just a little bit of background?
Yeah, sure. It could get to be a long story, so I'm going to keep it short and relevant. I'm working in the area of human and organizational development. I started doing organizational leaders training in cognitive thinking skills, and then became more interested in how we learn. And so I, in some ways, trained myself in organizational development and change management. And after doing a few years of that, really got interested deeply in human development. And even this evolution of my interest in some ways is an outcome of me really looking at my own development. You know, how am I developing? How am I growing? So in some ways, that's been a fundamental approach that I have used the self as instrument to observe development, and then in some ways to come up with my own understanding of development, and then to explore areas that are emergent or haven't been explored, and then integrating new aspects and dimensions that I've been learning. So I know that sounds a bit abstract. What that means is, and this is also the story of how I came to Integral, is I had all this training in cognitive skills. You know, these are the 10 steps to great decision making, or these are the 5 ways you can be more creative, kind of thing, until I realized that even with a good understanding of how to take good decisions, my personal life was a mess, many, many years ago. And I felt I hadn't taken the right decisions, and I was struggling with the situation I was in with the divorce and my, the difficulty with separation from my daughter. And so it really invited me to understand that just cognitive area is limited, and it pushed me into really exploring the subjective, the emotional aspects of my interior. And so I got interested in psychotherapy, and I got trained in using personal growth labs, doing reflective work, doing group relations work. And so that was definitely a very big milestone in my own development. And then I realized that both the cognitive skills and the way I was learning about my interior, they were both engaging my mind. And, my body was left out completely. They were the talking cures, and I felt it didn't feel whole. It didn't feel integral. And at that time, I didn't know the word integral. And so I got more interested in bringing my body in and becoming more aware of embodied practice. And I started learning Indian dance. And so that was a huge milestone in my development. And then I came to this yet another realization that even the mind and the body, they're both form, and there's a whole energetic, there's an energy space that can support my own development, or subtle energy work, if you will. And so I then learned Reiki and began practicing Reiki And I cured myself of a couple of long-standing physical issues, and that completely blew my mind, that there was a whole area, a whole aspect of myself that I could develop. So when I came into Integral, it explained my life. And I got deeply interested in one aspect of Integral, which was stages of development. So I started working with Suzanne many years ago, Suzanne Cookreuter, who's a seminal researcher in the field and a theorist and a great practitioner. So I've been working with Suzanne since 2004. And a little before I met Suzanne, I encountered Barry Johnson's work in polarities. And if you notice, the polarities that I navigated to get through my own development, cognitive and emotional, that's a polarity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not either this or that, and they seem to be in tension. And then mind and body, that's a polarity, you know, seem to be in tension, is either mind or body, and then we learn to integrate. And then form and formless, or form and energy, is another polarity. So it really felt like, you know, the integral framework, the adult development framework, the polarity framework lens all helped me understand my own growth and development. And there is no end to my fascination for how this is so informative and illuminating to me as I interpret my day-to-day reality, as I navigate, you know, my life today.
Right. Right. No, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Thank you. And thank you for sharing more of your background. And where are you from originally?
I'm originally from India. And I like to say from neither here nor there, because my father is from the north, my mother's from the south. In the last 10 years, I lived in the middle, the west central India. And so I think that's also very interesting for me, that I was an outsider even to the subculture that I lived in. When I lived in North India, I was seen as South Indian because my mom's South Indian. And when I lived in South India, I was seen as North Indian because my dad's North Indian.
Right.
And I think that that is the origin of my interest in polarities and looking at these tensions and opposites and looking at how do we integrate.
Right. Right. Well, when growing up amidst so much social and cultural polarization, it really sort of foregrounds how important it is for us to have some sort of process, some sort of method for us to actually begin to manage, well, first identify and recognize what the real sort of polarities at play are, and then learning how to manage and then ultimately integrate those polarities so that we can be healthier, happier, wiser, more productive, more effective. Yeah, and it's fascinating how your story really sort of begins like right sort of between these two, you know, strong cultural polarities within your country of origin.
Yeah, yeah.
Sort of explains how you got here in a lot of ways.
Yes, I
And,
think so.
and as I mentioned, so just in a few weeks, we're going to be launching this amazing new web course, and we're titling it Integrating Polarities. And I tell you, it is, Beena, I am just in love with this course. I think it's so powerful, and I think, you know, really our audience is gonna eat this stuff up. And you know, there's a few reasons why I'm excited. I'm basically excited for three really primary reasons. First off, because obviously our world is so freaking polarized right now. I mean, as far as I can tell, this is within America anyway, this is the most polarized we have been socially, culturally, economically, et cetera, since maybe before the Civil War. So I think that this polarity work is tremendously important because it's going to actually give us the tools to begin to sort of bridge that growing divide between us. You know, as Ken said in our last episode together, when we were talking about gun violence, you know, when it comes to polarization, we really only have two options. It's either we learn to manage and integrate these polarities, or it's war, right?
Yeah.
And there's really not much sort of in between there. So I'm really that we're getting this process sort of off the ground. And I think, you know, teaching people in a really you know, sort of really profound way, how to better navigate, you know, their own biases and their own blind spots and their own shadows, and, you know, really help us find a more positive and more productive way forward in the world.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I do see it as a foundational tool. And I think the polarization that we see in the culture today is more complex, because it also involves other factors, other aspects. And I think understanding stage development perspectives and how we interpret the polarization itself is an important piece to pay attention to. However, understanding polarities, I think, is foundational, and it gives us a really potent thinking vehicle to be clearer and kinder. You know, I'm also doing Byron Katie's work more recently around challenging beliefs, and in some ways I'm beginning to see how that marries into both ego development and polarity. So it's my current, in some ways, exploration and fascination. So I think being clearer and kinder is a very simple outcome.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I love that frame of clarity and kindness. And I love that you mentioned, you know, sort of how important this is to integral thinking itself, which is the second reason I'm really excited about this course. Because, you know, I've been saying for years that, you know, man, we have to find a way to systematize and teach integral thinking, sort of like we do, you know, critical thinking in high schools, or at least we used to teach critical thinking in high schools. One of the big reasons why we might be having so many problems with polarization is because we've stopped teaching critical thinking in high schools. But, you know, Ken has described polarity management as these are the mechanics of integral thinking. That was a quote that I think Ken said to you a while back. And I think that this is really, really important because, you know, usually what we hear in sort of integral world do is we usually teach people sort of the products of integral thought. You know what I mean? Like here are the quadrants, here are the levels, here are lines and states and types and et cetera. And we just sort of plunk it on your head and, you know, and as a result, it can sort of, you know, the model itself can feel, you know, a little bit static, I think, in a certain kind of way, and a little bit heavy. And what this does is I think it sort of, it brings some new life in a certain kind of way to the model. And again, really sort of scaffolds for people how to go about thinking integrally, how to do the same type of thinking that produces things like integral models in the first place. So that's, I think, something that really, really comes through in this course and through your teaching.
Yeah, I'm so glad you see it that way and you're highlighting that piece. So it is a skill. Polarity thinking is a skill, and I call it more polarity wisdom because it then brings in more mature perspectives as well. And as I'm thinking about how I got here, you know, I started doing, I was teaching thinking skills. And so if you look at what have we taught formally in our educational systems, we've taught information thinking first. And then we realized, well, information is not enough. We need to apply our critical faculty. So we need to teach critical thinking. And then you began to see that, well, critical thinking is not enough. We need to teach creative thinking, a creative problem solving. And so I've done both of that. I've taught critical thinking and I've taught creative problem solving. And it is so fitting that I then stepped into polarity thinking, which is a higher order thinking skill. And if you look at the integral model, it comes together because Ken recognized these polarizations. He would take a field of, he would take a field of endeavor, look at the various schools of thought within it, and understand and see that each school was privileging one aspect.
Right.
And then he was able to abstract and conceptualize, saying, hey, all these schools are privileging the individual. All these schools of thought are privileging the collective. And that is a polarity.
Right.
We're never going to solve the problem of which is the right answer by picking one or the other. And so he brought it together, the individual and the collective, in one frame, which is the integral frame. And then, laced it with the interior and the exterior, recognizing that different schools privilege the interior and other schools privilege the exterior. And the looking at a comprehensive model requires bringing these polarities together. So I think the fundamental thinking underneath the integral model is polarity thinking.
That's right.
And,
Yeah, I think so too.
and so that's why it's integrative.
Yeah. Well, and that's, which brings me to the third reason I'm excited, which is that it really does, it deepens my own relationship with the products of integral thought, with the integral model, itself. The integral model, as you were just saying, is itself composed of, just a handful of really fundamental polarities, right? I mean, it's interior and exterior, it's individual and collective, it's part and whole, it's emptiness and form, and what have you. And, really, sort of the idea is that all of, manifestation is sort of a fractalization of these really, really core polarities. Everything that exists somewhere between these fundamental poles. And rather than, seeing, therefore, the integral framework as some sort of static, unchanging kind of, almost like a diagram on the wall, this collection of I don't know, boxes and categories and colors and so forth, it comes alive. It starts to feel less like a static snapshot of reality, and more like this reflection of this living, breathing universe, one that is, obviously it's constantly changing and evolving and shifting, as sort of the different conditions and relationships and feedback loops that exist between all the different components of Aquil are themselves constantly changing. So this, to me, what polarities does is, to me, it feels like it takes this very almost concrete conception of the integral framework and it makes it dance. So polarities really does, it makes Aquil itself dance, and it's beautiful. I think it really is, it adds something really, really important to how we sort of classically think about Ken's integral framework.
Yeah, that is beautiful. I do believe it makes it more dynamic, because there is a dance between the interior and the exterior, the individual and the collective. And then across the diagonals, also there's a dance. There's a dance between the individual exterior and the collective interior. That's right. The diagonal. There's also a dance between the individual interior and the exterior collective. That's the diagonal. And so you can begin to see the dynamics diagonally between quadrants, across the quadrants, and it becomes like a dancing flower. If you actually trace the movements, it's very dynamic.
Yeah.
The other thing I recognized is, even after studying and steeping myself in integral for a few years and claiming to be integral, when I began to go deeper into polarities, I noticed that I was privileging some poles and neglecting others all the time.
Right.
And it occurred to me that I can't claim to be integral if I'm not able to integrate a polarity in my life attention that I am actively stuck in, where I'm rejecting something and then I'm moving towards something else and feeling that one is better than the other when they're both needed. And so polarity thinking and polarity wisdom helped me see how there was value in both. So I began then to notice how others also in the integral world were being integral intentionally and were not conscious when they were privileging a certain pole. And so it opens up a new world, new layers of how I can be more integral. So I found that to be hugely helpful. So what was revealed over time was my unconscious privileging of certain strengths or certain values or certain elements. And so I became more aware of what I wasn't aware of. So that also contributed to my development.
Right.
And I had another thought, it'll come back.
Well, yeah. And, and that process, I think, is just as important sort of in the exterior political world as it is in our interior, personal inner world. Just being able to notice when we are getting captured by one of these biases or blind spots. I mean, unless you really have, I think, a working familiarity with the polarity methodology, there's so many of these that are just going to go unrecognized because we just haven't taken the time to back up and really, examine, really what are my biases? What are sort of the main polarities that I find myself attracted to? And the poles that I really find myself repulsed by. Why am I repulsed by it? Is that something within me, or is that, something with, out there? And it draws us in. It invites us to start asking deeper, more meaningful, and really more revelatory questions in a certain kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got my thought back that I wanted to share, which is the integral model is like a meta model, and it identifies these 4 core poles. 2 polarities are lined up to give us the 4 quadrants. And of course, you talk about all the lines of development, and there are tensions and polarities between those lines, like the emotional line and the, let's say, the thinking or intellectual line.
Mm-hmm.
What polarities helped me see is that there's an infinite number of polarities I am seeking to navigate and harmonize every day. And so it literally expands the entire scope of being integral, because there's a tendency for me to limit myself to those 4 key polarities within the integral framework.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nice to have that as the uber sort of meta model, and then begin to explore all the other polarities at play. So it, in some ways, it multiplies the integral field, and it multiplies my exploration. So that's also, I think, very valuable.
Yeah.
And I'm noticing we're talking about polarities and we haven't actually defined them.
Well, yeah. So let's get into that. I just wanted to let everyone in our audience sort of why I personally am so excited by this course. But,
Yeah.
I figure now we can actually start, demonstrating some of this for people. And before we begin, Beena, let's start with a really, I think it sounds like a simple question to a lot of people, but it's really not when you start digging in. And that is the question of, what exactly is a polarity?
So polarity is a very, what shall I say, common word. It has many connotations, many ways in which we use the word polarity. And the way we are using it is codified in a particular way because it's useful, and it helps us leverage the dynamic that is natural when there are 2 elements in tension. So a polarity is not an opposite. A polarity is a pair of interdependent strengths or interdependent values that are both needed over time.
Mm.
So if you and I are in a friendship, relationship, partnership, we're working together, I might want to make it a successful partnership by making sure that you get what you need.
Mm-hmm.
And that's focusing on you. Another person in my place might focus on making a successful partnership by focusing on what they need, which is focusing on them.
Mm-hmm.
And you notice in each of these, it feels like in the first instance, focusing on you is a better idea, and that's going to bring us success. That's going to bring me success. And in the second instance, focusing on my needs is a better idea because that's going to bring me success.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a classic polarity. It's not either you or me. It's got to be both, because if I over-focus on making sure you get what you need and I neglect what I need, over time, this is not going to be a successful partnership. There's going to be a time where I begin to feel dissatisfied or I begin to feel frustrated. You get everything you want, even though I'm the one that's making that happen in my head. I'm not going to feel that this is working for me. And the flip side is also true. If I'm just making sure that I get everything I need and this is working the way I want, over time, you're likely to feel the neglect of your interests and your goals and your ideas and your vision. And it can take 100 forms, in terms of, are we doing inclusive decision making, or how are we working together, etc. But just fundamentally, so that is the polarity where it's not either you or me, it's both and.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been trained in either or thinking, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You just have to pick one or the other. It's either cost or quality. If I want quality, I have to forget about cost. If I want to focus on cost, I have to forget about quality. And so recognizing the either or mind functioning in a situation that requires both and is the skill. And it's a deep bias we have for finding the right answer and, picking one and doing away with the other, picking what we like and doing away with what we don't like. So a polarity is an interdependent pair. We say it's interdependent because this you and me is interdependent. If I focus too much on me, then it's a downside and I'll have to end up coming back to you to make it right. If I focus too much on you, I'll end up having to come back to me to make it right. And so we're interdependent. And so this also teaches us interdependent thinking and teaches us integral thinking. So I haven't actually explained it this way, but was that
no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think something that's really important that comes out of that is that a polarity is not, for example, a polarity is not something that has like an inherent positive and an inherent negative. So it's not like good and bad are a polarity we would want to spend time with. It's a pair that exists with some sort of, that has a dynamic relationship with each other and can each be enacted in positive or negative ways. Is that fair to say? Is that accurate?
Well, positive and negative comes when you overfocus on one or the other. So yes, you're right. It's not one good and one bad. So let me say, if I took care of you and focused more on you, I would end up neglecting myself. And if I took care more of myself, I would end up neglecting you. So it's easy to think about, what shall I say, inaccurately think about this as, oh, taking care of you and being selfish. That's the polarity. Either I'm selfish, that I'm taking care of me, or I'm taking care of you. And that's not a polarity because selfish is negative. It's the downside. If I only take care of me and don't take care of you, I become selfish. So that's the downside. And so one good and one bad doesn't make the polarity. And it's also not about, are we using it in positive or negative ways? It is, are we getting the wisdom of both? Am I getting the wisdom of taking care of myself? Am I able to tap into the wisdom of taking care of you? If I do one or the other, I end up in a negative place. But the polarity is actually taking care of you and taking care of me. And I need to do both, and you need to do both.
Right. No, it's very clear. And that's helpful because I do think a lot of times people, when they're thinking about polarities, they're thinking about these in sort of oppositional terms.
Yes.
They're thinking in terms of like, well, this one cancels this one out, or this one is obviously, is virtuous and this one is unvirtuous. And it sounds like you're saying if you're working with a polarity and those polarities have very strong sort of positive and negative connotations sort of on the surface, you might want to dig a little bit deeper and see if those themselves aren't manifestations of a deeper polarity that's being maybe underserved. So you mentioned selfishness. Selfishness is not itself a polarity that it doesn't exist in polarity in a way that, we would really want to tune into, but is itself sort of the symptom of a deeper polarity being undernourished or undermet or underfed in some way.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I think the skill is in teasing out from what appears to be negative, what's the wisdom that's hidden in that when you overdo it leads us to that negative.
Right. Yeah, I love it. So it gets us around the whole, you and I a couple of days ago were joking. It gets us around the whole problem of people evoking polarities in such a way that it's like one person says concentration camps are bad, and then another guy says, no, we need more concentration camps. And then someone in the middle is trying to manage the polarities, says, well, okay, guys, obviously we just need some concentration camps. That's not a way to integrate polarities, people.
Yes. That is not a way to integrate polarities.
That's
Yes.
not what we're talking about here. Well, and I think a lot of this will be, will become a bit more clear once we offer people an example. So once we have identified a particular polarity, sort of a pair of polarities that we really want to get into, and we really want to sort of unpack the positives and negatives and so forth, how do we do that? How does the integrating polarities process actually work? And can you give us sort of a quick example?
Yeah, sure. And we would call it a pair of poles, which makes it one polarity. So each polarity has two poles which are in tension, and they seem to pull us in opposite directions. They seem to be contradictory until we make the mistake of picking one over the other, and then we end up in not a great place. And then we recognize that we need the other in order to feel whole or to be integrated. So I can share with you an example that I have. Actually, it's a personal example. It's a polarity that I've been initially struggling with, and more lately being more harmonized around.
That would be fantastic.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. All right, so I assume you can see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, I'll put you up here so that my gaze is a little up. So you'll see here, there's on top, you see the integrated self, and at the bottom, you see the unintegrated self. And this is a little cycle that you'll all recognize, that you've all gone through in your life some way or the other. And it illustrates the dynamic of what a polarity is and how polarities work. The cool thing about this is it's not new. And it's very easy to walk away feeling, I know this, I've got it, and never really use it in a way intentionally to support our integration. So even if, anybody that's watching and listening, even if you don't take the course, my invitation is that you continue to explore the dynamic and continue to observe yourself and continue to practice so that you can get more and more. And I consider myself a user. I eat it, I smoke it, I drink it. It's just something that I guess I'm compulsive about. Okay, so this is my little story. So if you look at the top left quadrant, the trigger for my reflection is, what do I value? And how do I see myself? What is my strength? What's an enduring strength? What is something that I love to pursue? And in my case, it's growing and developing myself. It's just something that excites me, interests me, gives me energy. I love the idea of actualizing my potential. And as an outcome, I feel I can support other people, be a catalyst for their growth. So this is me. I define myself, one part of the way I define myself. And of course, the more I like it, the more I'll do this. And I found over time that I ended up over focusing on growing and changing and continuously wanting to be intentional to such an extent that I became too invested in improving myself and other people. So you know what that's like when you have a lot of advice about what everybody should do, how everybody else should change.
I'm so good at that.
Yeah. And then also so good at being critical of myself. I just haven't made the progress I should have made and not where I thought I could be. And it also prevented me from seeing where I've actually arrived, the movements I've made, and it prevented me from appreciating myself because I want to transform and I want to change and I want to grow. So this is not a great place to be. And I lived in this for a very long time because I interpreted it as being, well, it goes with the territory. This is collateral. I'm trying to change myself and this is what it takes. Until my suffering was so great that I realized if I didn't make the turn, if I didn't move here to this side, then it really wasn't sustainable. And so at those times of suffering, I wanted to be more attentive to the perfection within me, the true, the good, and the beautiful within me. I realized I needed to embrace and be forgiving of myself, loving myself as I am, and to then appreciate all the movements. I needed to do that because I was really struggling in number 2. So I did. I started experiencing and experimenting with that. However, because of our training, my training in either or thinking, because of my valuing the left side so much, very quickly, I would fear that I would stagnate because I'm now not growing. I'm now celebrating myself and feeling like I'm perfect. And so very quickly I would fall into this fear of I'm not growing, I'm stagnating, and I'm going to become complacent. And now I'm going to become superior, even feel arrogant that I have arrived. And I hated that. And I worried that I wouldn't actualize my potential, that I'd be less than who I can be. So for someone who defines herself with the upper left, this is the worst place to be, to stagnate, to not actualize my potential. So this is so uncomfortable that I would then go back immediately to changing myself and trying to improve, because I felt that was the better thing for me to do. That was the better way for me to be. So this is my little story. And we all have stories and cycles that mirror this, either the same kind of tension or 100 other tensions, but they follow the same dynamic. So you can see there are 2 tensions here. On one side, I'm drawn to transforming and growing. So I call that pole transforming. And on this side, I need to celebrate, need to savor, to celebrate, and to embrace where I am right here, right now. And historically, I've been privileging transforming and sitting in the left downside of this pole or this value. So the fundamental message is this is a tension. These are 2 poles of a polarity that cannot be solved by picking one over the other. Either way, I'm stuck. If I think transforming is better than celebrating, I'm going to be super self-critical. If I think, well, celebrating and just reveling in my perfection is the way to be perfect, then I am not going to grow. I'm going to become static and I'm not going to actualize what's potential. So it's so obvious to me now, even though my life was spent in privileging one pole, it's obvious now that they both I need to integrate these. So what is not the polarity here is transforming and stagnating, for example. That's an opposite.
Right. Right.
So transforming and celebrating is the polarity. So this is an example. And the way the dynamic works is we all move towards a value that we love. Like I move towards transforming, and for various reasons we move there. And then not very quickly, let's say we do more and more of it, and then we hit the limitations and we hit the downside. And then we are drawn to the opposite, which is the healing value. Celebrating is going to heal the problems of privileging, transforming. And so I'm drawn to go there, but very quickly I worry that this is what I'm going to get, and this is the worst place for me to be. And so I go back to what I always wanted. And this is the underlying hidden dynamic of the polarity realities. And surfacing this, becoming aware, helps me manage this better so that I'm not sitting in either downside.
Right. Right.
And if I manage this polarity well and I'm able to access the wisdom of transformation and access the wisdom of celebrating, then I get into a virtuous cycle and it elevates my system. It releases energy for further development. And if I privilege one or the other, it doesn't matter which, I will end up in the downside, in the vicious cycle, which leads me to be an unintegrated self. So the message is we need to integrate polarities in our life.
And this feels in a lot of ways, Beena, like it's sort of sequential. So, the first step is to simply develop the capacity to identify, to notice which polarities we're sort of oscillating between, and then notice how we're making this circuit. And
Yeah.
oftentimes left to our own devices, we're just making this circuit sort of unconsciously, right?
Yes.
We're just stuck in this infinity sign going, you know, from one pole to the other and positive to negative and back and forth again. And it seems like the next opportunity is actually to come up with an integration strategy that actually gets you out of that perpetual back and forth ping pong sort of cycle that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and you were never going to be able to get out of it.
Right.
We live in it, and we get to dance with joy. We get to dance better. So we sort of manage this in a way that we don't hit the downsides, and that when we begin to experience the downsides, then the healing force of the other pole, we can actively engage in that, and then that lifts us again.
Right.
And so when in the course, I'll actually share the bigger template and the tool around which we can do some intentional work and practice designing experiments for ourselves, so that we begin to try on, what is this other pole that I've been pushing away all my life? They just keep getting revealed to us as we begin to see them. So I was doing a lot of work around polarities, and after 15 years, a polarity emerged that I realized had been a 15-year cycle for me, which was between movement and stillness. So I was doing a lot of work, and I realized that there was a lot of dynamic movement, and I just hadn't had enough stillness in my life, even though I was doing meditation and, you know, I had all these practices, but they were all in the realm of doing and activity and doing something intentionally. And so doing and not doing became the polarity that then I began to work on. After 15 years, I realized I'd been doing it for 15 years and I hadn't even been aware of it, even though I'd been teaching polarities for those years. So that I find that fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, it is fascinating. You know, the other thing that I'm kind of keying into as I watch you show us this graphic is how any given polarity can itself be can really resonate with and almost it feels almost like a holographic sort of resonance, because you know you're showing me this polarity right here, and it seems to evoke so many other polarities fundamental, you know, just right out of the integral framework. I mean, there's something here about vertical health versus horizontal health. Something here about the sort of the ascending current of spirituality versus the descending current, or eros and having sort of directing your energy towards moving up the spiral versus agape and sort of embracing.
They're everywhere. And if you notice, you use the word versus. And so that itself pits one against the other. It's,
right.
you know, it's sort of combative. It's this versus that. And so polarity thinking invites us to change that versus to an and. It's vertical and horizontal, and it's you know, all the other pairs that you used. So if there's one thing, you know, listeners can take away, it's see when you use versus and ask yourself, is this really a versus? Because there are things that are opposing where you have to pick one and leave the other. So there are problems that are either or problems that you can solve by picking one thing and dropping the other, and problem solved. But imagine not recognizing when it's a polarity and using either or thinking.
Right.
I mean, that's not serving anybody.
Yep. That was fascinating. And it's really, you know, just by that simple sort of example that you offered us, which was very personal for you. You know, to me, I was really leaning in there, and I could just see how much juice there is in this process, and how much I could really relate with the struggle that you were able to sort of illustrate in those four boxes. I think all of us watching can really sort of relate with that.
And this is also everybody relate. Anybody who's involved in developing themselves can relate to it. They might use different words, they might formulate different values around it, but the tension we all experience as human beings when we want to grow and change, and then we recognize we don't need to, and we're not accepting. So changing and accepting could be another way of describing that polarity. And so it's a language clarification process where if I were working with you and you were experiencing some form of this tension, then we would find the words that were had more charge for you, and that would be meaningful and reflective of the way it shows up in your life. And then that would make it easier for you to work with it.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in terms of, you know, what this practice has, you know, to offer people in terms of their personal life, their relationships, their work in the world, et cetera, I thought maybe we would touch on some of those benefits, because it seems to me that, you know, in terms of how this affects us, how this benefits us personally, you know, it seems like there's a lot of opportunities in this practice for things like shadow work, for example. I mean, just by, you know, illustrating these poles and noticing how we respond to one or the other, it's a really, really great opportunity for self-reflection, and to see what kind of biases, what kind of blind spots that, you know, we might be walking around with that we don't necessarily know about yet until we see it sort of illustrated on a piece of paper in front of us. And I guess what I'm really curious is whether you think that practicing this process can actually accelerate development in any way, particularly ego development.
Very, very deeply so.
Mm.
And that's actually been my exploration as I've been studying ego development, working with it and teaching it, recognizing the contribution of polarity wisdom in ego development. And so very early on, I saw that one of the defining capacities at post-conventional stages of development is the capacity to do both and thinking. And so it immediately hit me that if we taught both and thinking, and if we helped people to see this dynamic, that it would be a lever to help people move from conventional to post-conventional meaning making. And so that's been an effort, and that's why we use this tool to support vertical development. And absolutely the benefits are in doing deeper interior work, and to also doing shadow work, because shadow work is that working with that which is not conscious, that which is pushed away and projected outwards. And so that dynamic you can see in polarities, and it comes alive in interpersonal relationships. So let's say you and I are working in a team, and you're let's say you hang out on the pole of safekeeping, and I hang out on the pole of adventurous, being adventurous. Mm-hmm. So we both privilege each of these because we see the value, and we think that that's the way to be successful, just to put it simply. Now, when we're working together, I think I'm being very adventurous, but you, on the other hand, are being very fearful. So now because I'm not seeing the wisdom of safekeeping, I project the downside on you. Mm-hmm. So I see you as being very fearful, and I'm being adventurous and bold and risk-taking. You, on the other hand, are embracing the value of safekeeping, and you're going to think, I'm not being fearful, I'm just being cautious. I'm being protective, and I need to be protective so that we create stability for ourselves or the system or whatever. Now, Beena, on the other hand, it can be foolhardy, and she is just, could even be crazy, you know, she's just doesn't know what she's risking, and she's putting so much at stake. And I might listen to that or get that feedback and say, I'm not being foolhardy, I'm being adventurous. How can we even embrace what's new? And how can we get into a brave new world without risking something and without being adventurous? So we each disown the wisdom of the other, and then we project the downside of the wisdom. So that is shadow work. Yep. In very simple terms. So yes, it's very helpful in doing personal work. It's helpful in every which way, because it is equipping your thinking, it's augmenting your thinking, it's augmenting the either or part of your mind with the both and part. It's augmenting more interdependent, higher level thinking than just being critical or creative. Like we talked about critical thinking and creative thinking. Mm-hmm. And it's scalable all the way up and all the way down in every way. It's applicable at the practical day-to-day level, day-to-day problems and issues, and at the very highest level of abstraction, whether you're a spiritual seeker we know, you and I know many spiritual seekers who privilege the absolute over the relative. That's a fundamental mismanagement of polarity, and that is not going to be a sustainable spiritual path.
Right. Right.
So it's also scalable all the way up and all the way down from a stage development perspective. So you can work with identifying polarities at every stage of development, and the later the stage, the greater capacity you have to see the dynamic and the depth and the realities. But at every stage of development, you're navigating the reality. You are experiencing the upsides and downsides of privileging one pole over the other, not recognizing that they come tied, that they're together, that they are complementary. And, you know, in some ways, you can say that preferences are the root of all evil. You know, if you prefer one pole over the other, you're going to end up in the downside. And so there are always two goods and two evils. It's not a good versus evil, but you need good, and then you need the other good together with it to marry, so that you can harmonize and heal what's not good.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. And, you know, I love also, Beena, how you sort of drop this into the context of interpersonal relationships, because this is, you know, another one of the big sort of catastrophes of polarization is what it has done to drive so many different kinds of wedges into our different communities, into our families, into our friends, into our colleagues and our social networks. And, you know, even the online integral community itself is in many ways becoming increasingly sort of balkanized and fragmented. Often due to, you know, our sort of collective inability to integrate these polarities, the sort of the polarities that lie at the core of so many of these interpersonal conflicts. So it sounds like you're really saying that, you know, not only will this be a sort of personal benefit in terms of, you know, us becoming more aligned with our own sort of deepest integrity, but it's also, you know, really sort of helping to promote more empathy and more cohesion sort of between us collectively.
Yes, it has taught me to be so much more appreciative of other people. Like if I find something in you that I don't like, and then I'm able to unpack that and see, well, that's the downside, but what's the wisdom in it? And then I'm able to tease that wisdom and then see the wisdom that's shining in the position you've taken, and then begin to see what's missing and what can I add to that, so that we can, so that I can harmonize and integrate with you. And integration is a big word. You know, integrating polarities, it feels, it's not just about integrating and you do one thing and you integrate it. There's so many aspects to it, and so much more nuance to what it takes to actually integrate a polarity, and so many dimensions you have to be including in that. What is the context? What is my preference? Is this short term? Is this long term? Are you including the whole system? Is it my choice? You know, do I have influence? All of these things have to be considered, and then you might choose to walk away also, and that would be managing a polarity well. Sometimes to walk away from a polarized community might be a good way of integrating a polarity that you might be struggling with. So it's not that simple, and everybody can work with it, because everybody can understand what this is about, because every human being works with it every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I feel like that's another sort of benefit that really comes with this, is not only does it help us, you know, sort of find a more holistic way to think about these things, and a more, you know, again, holistic way of sort of putting all these pieces together into a more integral view, but it also allows us to take the next step, which is like, okay, I've got this nice holistic vision, but now I've got to, you know, I need to produce action in the world. I need to do something. And sometimes doing something means being deliberately and skillfully partial in a particular context, so that you can, you know, move things in the direction that they need to move in, and having a sense of sort of, you know, how the pendulum is swinging in terms of these, you know, the positives and negatives of each pole, I think is going to greatly inform our ability to be deliberately and skillfully partial.
Yes, and we say that both and thinking is to augment either or thinking. We're not saying both and thinking is better than either or thinking. To say that would be an example of either or thinking.
Right.
So we're wanting to, augment it,
Yep.
and to use either or thinking in the service of the health of the system, and then to use both and thinking in the service also.
Right.
System.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. And then there's sort of the third, I think, major area where this can be helpful for us, which is, really making sense of the exterior world, navigating our way through it, and again, making more skillful action within that world. Within the course itself, we take a look at things like, the polarities of nationalism versus globalism, for example, which has become really a hot issue for a lot of people who are, very active politically. We talk about how polarities show up in everything from sexism to racism to gender inequality, and so forth. And, these are all really, really powerful, I think, applications, because it allows us to cut through so much of the noise that's being generated by, whatever sort of media conglomeration we happen to find ourselves in, all of whom are, telling these really, really partial and piecemeal sort of narratives. And we get lost, I think, in the conflicts. And, I think the other aspect of this too is how it's really going to be tremendously valuable for people who are in leadership positions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because it's going to allow them to take a much more sober view of these things, of the various sort of challenges and opportunities that they're facing, and sort of, again, to identify their biases and their blind spots and ultimately make better, more skillful, and more finely tuned decisions. And, as we said, perhaps most importantly, being able to make those deliberately partial decisions that can enact a whole lot of good for a whole lot of people, and sort of, help a system get sort of unstuck in a certain kind of way.
Absolutely. It's all of that, yes. And with leaders, it can also help them look at their culture and see the polarities that are being mismanaged and how they cause cultural pain, and to trace dysfunctionality to a polarity where one pole is being privileged. I mean, this is a bombastic statement, but I do feel that almost any dysfunctionality can be traced to some polarity being mismanaged or some pole being neglected. And I have yet to see that that's not true. Anything can be explored, any dysfunctionality can be explored from that point of view. And I do want to highlight that you talked about nationalism and globalism, that the positives and negatives of nationalism and the positives and negatives of globalism. It's very important to note that there is no inherent negativeness. There's no inherent negative to nationalism. It's when you privilege it and you neglect globalism that it becomes a problem, there's negatives. It's when you privilege globalism and neglect nationalism that there is a downside. But in themselves, they are both beautiful. What is not beautiful about having a pride for our nation? And what isn't beautiful about taking care of the globe and including everybody? So it's the part and whole polarity, and taking care of the part and taking care of the whole, both beautiful. There's no inherent negative aspect in each, but they are interdependent. And so if you privilege one over the other, then you are going to sit in a dysfunctional place.
Yeah, and what I'll be really interested in for us to get into in later episodes, Beena, is how to go about integrating polarities when you have terms like this, nationalism and globalism, being enacted in different ways by different altitudes.
Yes.
Which adds, some more sort of complexity to the conversation. So a green nationalism is going to look very different than an amber nationalism. So being able to sort of, tease those apart and plug those into the polarity matrix, I think is going to be, it's going to be an interesting series of conversations, I'm sure.
Yeah, and that's been a particular passion of mine, to tease out what I might call stage-related polarities. So there are some polarities that we struggle with as a function of our stage meaning-making. And working with those polarities will be particularly developmental than something that has to do more with a preference or more that style-related. So that would be really interesting to have that conversation with you, or maybe a series of conversations around stages and polarities.
Well, that's kind of the good news is we're going to be doing this together for the next year.
I know, that's so lovely. I mean, there's so much to talk about and share. And at some point it would be great to get questions and invite some participation. So, so we have a lot more voices at the table.
Yeah, we'll definitely be lining up, you know, some special Q&A episodes so that we can get, you know, some other voices in here, and so that people can ask you questions, because this is such rich material. And, you know, again, I just want to remind everyone, we've got this beautiful new course, Integrating Polarities. It's coming out in just a few weeks. You know, I really think, Beena, our audience is going to absolutely love this. As you can see from the conversation we just had, this is really a course for everyone. I mean, this is as much for, you know, leaders and professionals as it is for coaches and sort of community leaders, and for parents and practitioners, and, you know, people who are interested in things like personal development, and people who are, you know, sort of big integral geeks, for example.
And people who want to be more integral. I think this is
Yeah.
one mechanic.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think really anyone who wants to dive more deeply into these waters, this is for you. I really can't think of anyone for whom you know, this practice is not going to be tremendously beneficial for. So I'm really excited.
I want to thank you for your excitement and your enthusiasm, and I am really thrilled to situate this work within the integral complex, if you will, you know, which includes the theory, the concepts, the products, the artifacts, the community, the people, the resources, the content, the knowledge. And I'm just thrilled to have this be embedded within it. It's the gift that keeps on giving. It's been endlessly helpful for me. It has made me so humble, and it has helped me look within and own the things that I reject, and it has taught me to seek the wisdom of what I reject. So I'm deeply appreciative of the work, and thank you just for your excitement. You know, that means a lot. You're not just doing this as a topic and, you know, just creating a show, but I can see how interested you are in really diving deep and making this available and offering something really valuable. I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you for saying so, Beena.
I do. I find this endlessly illuminating, and joy gives me a lot of joy to explore. So thank you.
Beautiful. All right. Well, in the meantime, thank you everyone for watching us today. My name is Corey DeVos. This has been Beena Sharma. Beena, thank you so much.
Until next time, thank you.
All right.
Bye.